questions from somebody else?
Sure. Can I go now? Okay.
Yep, sure.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Jorge Besala. So I have three questions for you. I saw it was a few weeks ago, or maybe a month or a month and a half. You had a great chat with a guy whose name was Jeff. I think he runs Dollar Vigilante. You had a conversation with him. Jeff Berwick, and in it, you mentioned that you were a fan of like people running for office, like Ron Paul did, because it helped bring a lot of publicity to libertarianism,
Yes.
and so on. And I was just wondering if enough libertarians are willing to help you, with a Facebook page and a website, would you be willing to run to help spread an understanding of freedom?
Nope. I believe in the division of labor.
Okay. Okay.
The job that Ron Paul was good at.
Okay, great. So
I don't think it's a job I would be terribly good at, and I don't think it's a job I would enjoy. I think my job is trying to create and spread ideas through mechanisms like this.
It's just humble people.
Okay, great. So, so in your classic, The Machinery of Freedom, besides dedicating the book to your father and Robert Heinlein, you also dedicate the book to Friedrich Hayek. Can you tell us about Hayek's influence on you and
Sure.
maybe his
Very
place?
small, but it was one specific, I thought, important idea, and that was the distinction between an organization and a self-generating order. And that was from a talk I heard him give once. And really, I've read The Road to Serfdom. I don't think I've read much of the rest of his stuff, but I thought that was a very useful way of thinking, that a market economy does not have a purpose. A club or a corporation in some sense does have a purpose, or an individual person has a purpose. But that what a market economy, and there are other things like that, that's just one example, is a way in which a set of people who have different purposes nonetheless interact and coordinate their activities. So that it's very natural to think of a country, as it were, or a market, or a society, and say, well, look, it ought to be doing X. And that's the wrong way of thinking about it. And that I got that from Hayek, and that, as I remember, was the reason I put it in that list.
Okay, great. So here's another question. So, Murray Rothbard, just like you have written this famous book, and you're a famous anarco-capitalist. He wrote an article where you both reach the same conclusions, but he goes about it with another way, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. So in his 1977 article called "Do You Hate the State?" he writes that there runs through For a New Liberty, and most of the rest of my work as well, that's Rothbard talking about his work, he says, a deep and pervasive hatred of the state and all its works, based on the conviction that the state is the enemy of mankind. In contrast, it is evident that David does not hate the state at all. In short, there is no sign that David Friedman, in any sense, hates the existing American state or the state per se, hates it deep in his belly as a predatory gang of robbers, enslavers, and murderers.
Right.
So my question is, Professor Friedman, do you see the state as a quote-unquote predatory gang of robbers, enslavers, and murderers? And how do you describe the state?
To begin with, if you look on my blog, I've got a blog post in which I cited that article and responded to it. Okay. And what I basically said is that Rothbard is correct, that I don't hate the state, that I prefer to do my thinking with my head and not with my guts, that ultimately I think of the state as a mistake, that there are certainly some people in it who deliberately benefit themselves at the expense of others, but the state exists because most of the population believes the world would be a much worse place without it, and it seems to me unreasonable to be angry at somebody who accepts the views that everybody around him says, views which seem reasonably plausible, and those views tell him unless you support the existence of the state, or unless people in general do, terrible things will happen. So he does. That does not seem to me to make him a villain. And a point which I think I made in my blog post is that one of the problems with Rothbard's point of view is that once you take that point of view, there are very few moral constraints on how you're going to fight the state, including lying to your own side. That is to say, if you really have this view, this is good against evil, well, little details, like the fact that what you're saying isn't true, shouldn't get in the way of fighting evil, should they? And I've gone through at some length Rothbard's historical work, where I think he was quite deliberately dishonest, in particular in his comparison between Adam Smith and the French contemporaries, the physiocrats, where he, for example, one example, he says, look, Smith isn't really a libertarian, he's in favor of taxing wool, taxing the export of wool. What would you think of somebody who is describing the present American scene to someone who knew nothing about it, a man from Mars, and says, so-and-so isn't really a libertarian, he's in favor of taxing marijuana, and did not explain that this was in a context where marijuana was illegal, and the proposal was to convert a ban into a tax. As Smith makes perfectly clear in The Wealth of Nations, which I presume Rothbard read, at the time he was writing, it was illegal to export wool. This law was enforced with ferocious penalties to prevent people near the coast from traveling, from carrying wool around, basically, which they might then put on a ship and send away. And what Smith was proposing was that you replace that with an export tax. Smith was not an anarchist. He clearly believed that you did need taxes to fund the minimum function of government, and he offered some reasons why he thought that tax was somewhat less damaging than other taxes. But to simply tell people he's in favor of a tax and not tell them that it's replacing a ban with a tax seems to me blatantly dishonest. That would be one example. There's a second example where Smith's side of it, the Smithian description is wrong but not obviously dishonest. And that's the question of schooling. That Smith has a very long discussion of alternative ways of doing schooling. And it includes parts where he's giving arguments for government schools and parts where he's giving arguments against. And if you actually look at his final summary, it amounts to saying that to have some government subsidy to education is not unjust, but it might be more prudent to leave it entirely public. And that's where he leaves the question. So it's really an open question. So Rothbard, if I remember correctly, and I'm pretty sure I do, but I have to go back and check, says that Smith's in favor of public schooling. And he's contrasting him with some French writers. And he does not mention that the French writer he is praising, as a government official, wrote a letter to the King of France proposing the nationalization of the educational system. All right. Well, that's surely relevant if you're comparing the two. So there are other examples. If you go to my blog and you do a search for Rothbard, you can find my post where I responded to that particular piece by Rothbard, and that's got a link to a long exchange I had with some people over Rothbard's historical stuff. But I also have an example, which I can't prove because it was in conversation. Well, it was a conversation after a speech. But Rothbard gave a talk at some point to a libertarian audience many, many years ago, and I can't even tell you where it was, in the course of which he was arguing that Reagan was not really a good guy, and his evidence was that government expenditure went up under Reagan. The numbers he was quoting were nominal, not real. That is to say, they were not allowing for inflation. In the question period, I pointed that out and said, in order to make a fair comparison, shouldn't you allow for inflation? And Rothbard's answer was that since the inflation was the government's fault, you shouldn't use it to make them look better. Well, what is he saying? He's saying because it's their fault, it's all right to deceive my libertarian audience by using it to make Reagan look worse than he is. Is the argument clear? Right? Suppose, I don't know the numbers, let me make up numbers, but suppose that what had happened over Reagan's period in office was that government expenditure had gone up 50% and prices have gone up 50%. That's an exaggeration, I think. If you simply say government expenditure went up 50% and you don't mention that prices went up 50%, you make it sound as though he increased the size of government. That's what Rothbard was doing, except I've made up the numbers. Who are you to see? You're certainly making Reagan look better than if you said, well, in real terms, expenditure stayed the same. But you're making him look better because it's true. So what Rothbard was defending there explicitly was because it was a good cause to make Reagan look bad, therefore it was all right to mislead his audience, which consisted not of Reagan but of libertarians, by presenting the information in a way which exaggerated how bad it was. And that struck me as the kind of thing that convinced me that I disapproved of Rothbard.
All right, so my last question, I mean, right now I'm not looking at that article where you already described Rothbard. So this is somewhat related. It's also related to that article. And so in the same article, he says, let's take the two leading examples of anarcho-capitalist works, For a New Liberty and David Friedman's Machinery of Freedom. He says the major differences between them are my own stand for natural rights and for a rational libertarian law code, in contrast to Friedman's a moralist utilitarianism. So my question is, are you familiar, or how familiar are you with Rothbard's concept of natural rights? And if so, can you tell us your thought about it? And can you tell us about your views on morality?
Yep. There are really two different differences that are embedded there, only one of which is making it clear. One of them is that Rothbard is assuming that there will be a uniform legal code worked out essentially by philosophers, whereas I am assuming that there will be a polylegal system in which the law code is produced on the market on the basis not of a philosopher deciding what is just, but of somebody running an arbitration agency deciding what people are going to want to live under. All right? That's the difference in the models, basically. Beyond that, I have never seen a derivation of natural rights, or indeed of any moral claims, that seems to me to be convincing. That I have moral beliefs, I have arguments for those moral beliefs, but I don't think that moral philosophy has been a terribly successful project. I think there's a reason why philosophers still read Aristotle and economists don't, or physicists don't for that matter. And it therefore does not seem to me that if I say the reason you should do this, I guess this is really two different points. One of them is if I want to persuade somebody, saying the reason you should do this is it's immoral to violate people's rights. Unless I actually have a way of demonstrating that that's true, and a way that's good enough to make it reasonably clear what those rights are, I'm not going to persuade somebody. And I don't think that either Rothbard or I does. Beyond that, in terms of setting up a law code, it seems to me that that is not a problem which can be solved by trying to figure out what's just. I don't think we understand justice well enough, or right and wrong well enough. So that does not strike me as a sensible solution. So, as I say, at the level of the institutions we're imagining, the basic difference is that his is closer to a standard modern system because his has one law code, and the problem is where you get it, whereas mine is actually a market for law, which is not. I should say I'm not a utilitarian. If you actually look up utilitarian in the index of Machinery of Freedom, the entry is utilitarian, why I am not. But I am in favor in persuading people of using consequentialist arguments. And the standard counter-argument is to say you can't persuade somebody they should do something by consequentialist arguments because you have to show that the consequence is one they should like. And my response to that is that in practice, there's a very large overlap among what people think is desirable. That it's logically possible to believe that it would be better to have a world where everybody was hungry, ignorant, and miserable. But in fact, there are very few people who hold that position. So if I can demonstrate to people with a relatively small range of what they see as desirable, that in terms of their views of what's desirable, my institutions will achieve it better, I don't have to persuade them of what's right and wrong. They already have beliefs about what's right and wrong. So therefore, my view has long been that the right argumentative strategy is not to try to make the moral arguments, but to try to use economics mostly to say, here is why this system will produce these results which are more attractive to you than the results we now have, and leave it at that. So that would be, I guess, my view.
All right, well, thank you for answering my questions. Next.